So, welcome to the panel. Where is the Metaverse heading? We actually kind of started the Metaverse journey with, I think it was Snow Crash in the early 90s, and then went over Second Life, and in the last 2 years, Meta or Facebook really kind of put the bet in there, and we saw decentralized and blockchain-based metaverses emerge. And of course, we want to look at what's happening there at the moment and where are we actually kind of taking it further. And it's my pleasure to have three amazing panelists with me. On the one hand side, Nicola, who has been a product leader and is an entrepreneur in the kind of gaming space, and as well really interested in digital fashion. So we'll basically take it from here. We have Rebekka, who basically looks at Metaverse as well, more from an academic side plus an artist side. And I learned yesterday evening that you're as well interested in communities, and Metaverse is about communities. And we have Duncan Ross here, who is a seasoned technology executive and a partner in crime with me at Tsunami. So welcome and thank you for being on this panel. So I would like to kick it off straight away and kind of ask first the tough question of what is the Metaverse and actually what is it not?
I mean, I think it's a good question, right? Look, I'm a gamer and I come from the games industry. And for me, the Metaverse is kind of any kind of place where you can connect with someone else online. I even consider the early days of MSN and stuff to be some form of a metaverse. It's not always just this thing that you see in the movies with that Ready Player One and stuff like that, where you need that big technology. It's just somewhere where you can go, you can connect with other people unhindered and kind of in an online environment. So that would be my definition.
Obviously coming from an academic background, we struggle with definitions of everything. It always comes down to one word and we try to pick it apart. And I don't think it's quite emerged exactly what the metaverse is or what it's going to be. We're at a very unusual kind of crossroads. And I think it is also a spectrum of things, right? Like you mentioned, it has foundations in very more rudimentary aspects, but it can also be very immersive. So I think it's very undefined at the moment because we're really seeing the emergence of what it's potentially becoming.
Well, I've been in the games industry for a long time as well. I've spent nearly 20 years, so I have that kind of background in the past. And one thing I would approach it from a different perspective where it's not. And in my belief, there's erroneous sort of thinking from a lot of people is that Metaverse is the VR headset, is the Ready Player One, is the virtual reality where you do things you want to do in real life and so on and so forth. It's much bigger than that. I see it almost that the Metaverse is already here and we're actually building. The Borderless is actually the Metaverse in some way. The Borderless is a digital world that we can build and we can all benefit from real life from. In some way, I don't want to sound dystopian in this case, but it's a parallel reality in some way that we can perhaps build better than we have our real world right now. And I think there's part of it is a philosophical conundrum that we are yet to solve. Part of it is a technical conundrum, yet again, that we're yet to solve and how we approach it. But at the end of the day, I think the pigeonholing it is the wrong thing to do. And that's the important aspect of it.
So it's still a bit more a concept, but clearly not what everybody thinks on the first view. Still, I would love to dwell a bit on that kind of, how are we currently looking at the metaverse? And apparently there's two different approaches. It's the more centralized pieces of metaverse, so worlds like Meta Horizon or even Fortnite, to stay with a bit of the gaming perspective, which are the centralized players. And then you have the emerging decentralized blockchain-enabled players like a Decentraland or Sandbox, who have basically emerged in the last 2 years. So, and it feels to me a bit like there's a tug of war, and they really don't want to integrate with each other, at least decentralized, not yet. So how do you see this playing out, that tug of war? And maybe Duncan, you can come from that perspective first.
And again, I think So our traditional, we think about centralized metaverses that there are right now, which are mainly gaming based rather than social aspects based, and they're not where they need to be. If we were to create this fairer world in any way, or create a different world, a parallel world there, we need decentralization as part of one governance and also a token of value. So right now, through previous panels we discussed, and one of the interesting things we touched, that NFTs is currently a digital token of value. It doesn't have to be a piece of art. It doesn't have to be just, a picture somewhere. It could be assigned to anything, and if we were to create an economy and sustainability of the ecosystem that goes around as part of the metaverse, and looking at it as a society rather than anything else, we need decentralization in this case. And I think, just like I said, the various side chains and various other aspects of coins that we have that nobody really using, they just exist for the same reason. I believe there will be thousands of metaverses in the next few years, and eventually there will be the ones that are most prominent, where people will stick, that people will believe in, and I believe are the ones that will deliver the value behind it, which is that core belief of the promised land in a way.
I am not so much in the gaming industry, but I can speak from an artist perspective, or seeing how communities are being built within different pockets that are metaverse driven. For example, Spatial or Solaris, where artists can create their own individual galleries and art experiences where people can kind of come into it. And it is less centralized in the sense that there are a bunch of these smaller projects that people can kind of gather in and create different experiences. And so I think that might also be a path forward, where we see a lot of smaller projects kind of building their own path forward in whatever area they are, whether that's art or different interests, for example.
So if we, and I understand that it's about those communities which create something, how important is the ownership piece in there? Because I would say the creation could happen, maybe with some limitations, because like the platform, centralized platforms wouldn't allow certain creations, but in principle it could happen, but the decentralized versions offer true ownership. Is this really important for the communities you are looking at?
I mean, it overlaps with a lot of DAO topics and a lot of how organizations are actually implementing that, right? The topic of DAOs is an enormous one that is really, really challenging in a lot of different contexts, especially geographically, because if you run up into different legal problems. And so there are a lot of communities that would love to have that really deeply decentralized aspect, also legally, but we're not at the point yet where we can actually see how that's effectively implemented. So I think there's also this tension between where communities want to go and what they would like to create in the metaverse in a decentralized way, and also what's literally technically possible at this point in time.
Great. And Nicola, you basically did the jump from a more centralized games approach to now being a kind of entrepreneur in the decentralized space. So what are you seeing there when it comes to communities and creation and ownership?
I think one of the challenges that I saw in traditional gaming was kind of the amount of time and energy people were putting into the games, and they weren't necessarily getting something back. So they were getting like this illusion of ownership. And you especially saw it with like guild leaders in games. So they would traditionally work really hard to engage their guild, get them to participate in certain mechanics, build even websites and stuff to really go beyond, but they would never get kind of any clear reward or any kind of like clear recognition from the game system itself that they were putting in this kind of work. So I think like what the metaverse is allowing and kind of what we're transforming to is really recognizing this and actually giving people not just the illusion of ownership, but actual digital ownership that they can take with them to other experiences that would also be cross-compatible.
Great. So I get this component of, it's about communities, ownership, creation, and it goes beyond gaming. But if I go today on Decentraland or any of those kind of decentral kind of metaverse expressions or spaces, I'm lucky if I meet 2-3 other people, or if it doesn't look like the Berlin in front of the Adlon Hotel, or a meme which is going on Facebook at the moment, or Twitter actually. So how relevant is the whole metaverse, and especially decentralized metaverse at the moment on the usage perspective? And maybe a second question, assuming you say it's maybe not really mass relevant, what would be the breakthrough, or how could we see that there's really a breakthrough of, let's say, mass adoption?
I think there's kind of like 2 phases with it. There's always like this first wave of what I would call like the content creators. So you kind of saw it like with Roblox. Roblox has been around for a long time, actually, before it even got very big. And the first wave of, let's say, consumers that were on that platform were just the content creators. So they weren't there to socialize. They weren't there to do anything. They were just kind of using the platform to create. And then it kind of, once the content kind of developed and it kind of got there, then naturally people there was that mass adoption, because there was actually something to do there for people that maybe didn't want to just use the platform to create. So I see it kind of in a 2-wave.
And now that's from a point of reward, right? As you touched it a little bit as well, as saying that, people don't want to do something for nothing in a way and don't spend a lot of time and not get rewarded. And again, part of my belief is that within these spaces of metaverses, as we call them, there will be jobs. There will be decentralized finance probably as part of it. There will be loans. We've heard about several mortgages being issued in Sandbox in Decentraland on virtual properties. So somebody will have to service these needs somewhere else. So therefore, I think the breakthrough is the utilitarian aspect of it. If somebody has effectively you go to your work in the metaverse, right? Then you'd rather be there than you'd be, in McDonald's, serving chips. Maybe that's a better aspect. So this right now doesn't exist. There's a handful of sort of play to earn games, effectively, where some people earn some money in some way, and there's some ways of making, but you can't really call it a living in many ways. It doesn't contribute to your well-being, doesn't contribute to your space. If I could, I don't know, make a painting or create a piece of art in the metaverse somewhere else, there's value to something, and then take it out and utilize it somehow in the real world as well, that also benefits me. Perhaps have a discussion about this piece of art with friends or something else, but then rather raises my status as an artist, or maybe it raises some funds for me, something else, then that becomes useful. As an entertainment value, that's a different thing. So I think there's a differentiation of metaverse as a game, as a piece of entertainment, and metaverse as a space, as you called it. I think it's a very good word for it. But it's something that's actually useful for you as a human being.
Yeah.
Lovely. So let's look at my son. He's 14 years old. 10, 15 years ago, I would have given him a recommendation, go to learn computer science, programming, and so on. So taking that concept of there's new jobs in the metaverse, what kind of job should I, should I recommend to him? Is it on the artist creation side? Is it about, you said, the finance people in the metaverse, the metaverse bankers, or is it, the builders, the architects who build, constructs and spaces there? What do you think? What should I recommend to my son?
Well, it would be very bold of any parent to suggest that their child becomes an artist. It is not
in the metaverse.
It is not an easy path in the metaverse or not. I really see that it's not just one skill set. It's a multitude, because you see the majority of people in the Web3 space, we have moved from thing to thing to thing, and you gather skills in all these different places. And I think it's this quality of curiosity and willing to learn and willing to try new things, and this innovation, that is really the most important thing. It doesn't necessarily matter where you start out, because that's not where you're going to end up. And we can see the statistics in terms of how often jobs are being changed by younger people. And it's not this, back in the day, someone would have a job for 30 years, and that's not the case anymore. And so I think it's more the qualities of trying something out, learning from it, and continually seeing where it takes you and growing.
I would second that as well, is having spent a long time in the games industry myself, is one of the hardest industries to hire for. Because to be a developer within, as an example, within like any kind of game, you need to know about a lot of things, not just one thing. You can't be a specialist in something, just that. Because you're creating a virtual world for somebody to believe it. Therefore, you need to know how the car works, how the sun, bounces off the walls, how the world overall, how the physics, the math behind it, all sorts of things. So you need to be a multi-skilled individual to be able to perform in this. Therefore, the jobs, I would say, is actually curiosity and being interested in as many things as possible, and a generalist, so to say, but in some way that's the way forward, because you can specialize going forward, but you have to start with a base knowledge of everything.
Good answer.
I definitely think that's like true as well, because who would have thought like now, back in the day, that like an influencer would be a thing? I think it's not like 100% clear like what's possible, and I think like we're going to find our way. The more the technology develops and the more roles that kind of become apparent, it will kind of find the way. So do it, play with it. I wouldn't have it as like a career right now. I wouldn't recommend it like to anyone, like just to jump on and give up and just be like a play to earner or something like that, because I think like the mentality needs to change, that you're doing something in order to earn. It should be the priority one should be that you're doing it to have fun, and then the benefit is that you're owning what you're getting out of that experience first. And we'll see in the next years how it develops.
Good, thank you. Kind of now, shall that take that back immediately? Kind of and talk to my son at least tomorrow morning. Hopefully, there's a longer night ahead of us. So let's kind of tackle one topic still before we hopefully have a chance to answer questions from the audience. Let's think about identity. No? Because if I'm basically looking at Metaverse, this is as well an opportunity to basically build a second parallel identity. And the question I'm asking myself, are people rather like, extending their real identity into the Metaverse and basically be the same, maybe a little better, incremental, better, avatar or identity, or are they intentionally taking a very different role there? So how do we kind of, what does especially research tell us as well, or your experience tells us kind of, on which direction people are going, and what are the opportunities and challenges maybe in general from that multiple identities?
I don't know if there's any research that has necessarily been done on the choices people make in terms of how closely they choose to identify with their own image. And I think it really depends on the platform as well. Like there's some much more fantastical metaverses where it's unusual to sort of look a little bit more human, or there's also contexts where looking more human is maybe your only option, therefore you go with something that is more representative of yourself. So I think it's very context dependent. I think there's cases where people would be a little more creative and be a little bit more out of the box in some situations, and a little bit more conservative, or trying to represent their own self a little bit more. So I think there's a lot of factors involved. Obviously, it's also a large personality question, and a question of who they're interacting with and what's the context behind it. Is it going to be a business meeting? Are they visiting an art gallery? Are they hunting ogres? So I think it's very case dependent, but it's absolutely an aspect of identity that people are going to be able to experience in a different way that has never really been explored before.
I think like a lot of like avatar creators that are out there, or like digital identity creators which are out there, need to add a bit more variety of kind of what you can do, because in the end, like in the digital world, there is no limits, and I think we can get a lot more creative with it. But I also think it depends on kind of like the generation that's kind of utilizing it. So for example, my granddad is a gamer, and it was surprising to know that kind of when he goes into like a game, he makes something that's completely insane. Like he'll be a dragon person if he could. But if you compare that to my cousins who are playing the same game, they just make like a digital version, carbon copy of themselves. So I think it's kind of like just making sure that the options are out there to kind of let people play, but also pushing and seeing kind of what you can do with the digital technology, but also making sure that it's a bit more inclusive. Because also what I've noticed is kind of like a pattern of being the best version of yourself, but that's also neglecting some authenticity, I guess, of maybe some flaws or some other things as well. So I think like a lot more platforms could be a lot more inclusive in embracing that.
I would push it even further, right? I think the next step of evolution for us as human beings hopefully started where we started to challenge social normative rules. For example, gender, right? Why do I have to identify as male or female in many ways than one? I could be, why do I have to behave in such a way that isn't acceptable just because somebody says they should be wearing such clothes or whatever else because it's not acceptable? It doesn't mean it's not something that I identify with. And the identity also comes with the fact that in such metaverse as identity, you can be truly borderless in some way. You can create the identity that you wish to create and create potentially even a community that you wish to create, which perhaps otherwise wouldn't be socially or normally accepted in the real world in one way or another. And that's just one of the small aspects where I think this sort of power dimension, as I call it, would help us going forward.
Great, thank you very much. I had now the opportunity to ask a lot of questions which were on my mind. There's many more, like, in there, and we can discuss more. Are there any questions from the audience to our wonderful panelists here on the metaverse and where we're heading?
Where do you see? Sure. No, I'm no stranger to a mic. Ken Berger here. Anyway, where do you see the industry heading in terms of, is it just a couple platforms that take everything? There's a lot of people saying that crypto eventually will be basically just Bitcoin and one other. Some people say that. Where do you see that happening? Is there going to be a couple of Facebooks and Googles? Or is it really going to be decentralized with a bunch of different brands, that kind of thing? Where do you see it, 10 years from now or something in terms of, you get my point, I think.
I think that maybe I'll start and I'll give you an opportunity to add. We touched a little bit on it, and my belief is that we are in a period of experimentation, and in that period, there'll probably be thousands at the beginning, right? At the beginning. And then lots of them will filter out because they'll be either relevant, not broad enough, or they won't get traction for one reason or another. And it's almost like a Darwinian evolution in some way, the survival of the fittest. The ones that survive that truly, I believe, the ones that will bring those utilities that we discuss here to the masses, and all of us will benefit from them one way or another, or can benefit from it. And the more we can benefit from it, the more they'll become relevant. So maybe 5-10 years time, there will be 1, 2, 5 of them, something like this. But I think in the next, let's say, a few years, there will just be lots of experiments.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's just going to be like loads of little ones, and it will be the survival of the fittest, so to say. But I think like in an ideal world, right, we can kind of picture it as sort of planets and bridges between them. So kind of like these bigger players and kind of like different planets, so to say, with kind of bridges and portals where you can kind of go between them rather than just having like the winner takes it all in a way. I think that would be like an ideal situation. But being a game developer, I know technically, I think that's a bit out of our reach right now, but that's at least my aspiration, my hope of how it will develop.
I could also imagine that, there are a lot of niche pockets that have been developing, like the artist ecosystem on Tezos, for example, and seeing how each of these internalized communities develops and grows and has their own identity. And I could also imagine that even if there are a few really large players, that there are smaller communities that still want to retain that, and they still hold true to their Solaris galleries or whatever it is, right? Because you also see it within these smaller communities that they are building really deep relationships. They feel very attached to the platform or whatever it is that is being built. And so I could imagine that those also hold out on a longer scale as well. But in 10 years, it's the cycle, right? If there are just a few big players, there might be also a reaction against that, right? That not everybody wants to partake in whatever Meta is doing, for example.
Great, thank you very much. I take away a few things like, it's still quite a concept. It doesn't hasn't fully mass adopted yet. Secondly, I learned that it's about like those two phases. You start a bit on the creator and side and get the flywheel going, and usage and engagement will come. And I love the broad horizon we basically opened on identity, and not being either or. It's like depending on the personality of the very individual who goes there. And thank you very much. It was lovely to chat with you. Thank you for the audience also. And if there's any questions
There's one question there in the back.
Yeah. Okay, then let's ask it and then a very quick tweet-style answer, all right?
Yeah.
Good.
Yes or no only.
42.
This one's really easy. Is there a certain age group that you're targeting?
With like the metaverse, I think the metaverse is for like anyone, right? Like I want my nana to be able to use it. That's kind of like where it would be, but I think Gen Z would be the most progressive.
I agree. It's also want to challenge the status quo and those social normative aspects of life.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I still have two interesting panels to go.